Hi. Welcome to this third session of the VAMP Spring Seminars 2023. Uh, Today, I'm very pleased and happy uh, to welcome Noemi Magnani. She is currently at University of Hertfordshire, but she was also telling us that she also teaches at Birkbeck College, University of London, where she also got her PhD. And today she's going to be introducing us to the concept of maternal duties in Wollstonecraft and the relationship with freedom. So just go ahead, take it home.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen now so you can see my presentation. Okay, can you see it? Good. Okay, so thank you very much for having me today. I was about to say thank you so much for having me tonight, but it's not only for me. It's 7 p.m. where I am, but not for you. So good afternoon, everyone. So in my talk, I'm gonna focus on the relationship between education and freedom, especially for women in Wollstonecraft's philosophy. So this is basically what I'm going to say. So I will try to offer an answer to two interrelated questions. The first one is, what is the true purpose of educating women in Wollstonecraft's view? The second one, which is of course related to the first, is whether such an education would make women free and independent. My presentation will be divided in roughly 3 parts. The first one has to do with knowledge and independence and virtue as the basis for Wollstonecraft's educational and political theory. So I'm going to introduce these concepts and how she understands them. Then I'm going to talk about why women are particularly in need of a better education according to Wollstonecraft and what this education should consist in. The last part is going to be on citizenship and maternal duties. More specifically, I will introduce you to some objections to what Wollstonecraft says about the education of women and some possible responses, because I really like her work, and so I'm trying to defend it. Just so you know, this is a paper that I originally wrote when I was still a graduate student. But I'm trying to rework it so that possibly in the future I will be able to publish it. So any objections or concerns or suggestions, please let me know. Okay, before I start the presentation proper, I'm going to say a few words about Mary Wollstonecraft herself. You probably know her, she's quite famous, but even if you haven't, this is who she was. So she was born in 1759 in London. She also died in London in 1797. So she had a relatively short life. She was only 38 when she died. She was a writer, a moral and political philosopher, and an advocate of women's rights. Some people say that she was one of the first feminists, although, of course, she wouldn't have called herself feminist because the word was not there yet. But still, she came from a financially unstable family. She had a quite unusual life for the time, also quite sad life in many ways. Because she came from a difficult family, she also had no formal education. So we don't know exactly how much she knew about other philosophers, for instance. She knew bits and pieces, but of course she didn't go to Oxford or Cambridge, that's it. As in addition to writing for most of her life, she also worked as a ladies' companion, as a governess, and she also founded a school, which was quite short-lived, for girls, together with 2 of her sisters and 1 of her friends. So she knew something about education and about the education of girls in particular. She herself had 2 daughters. Both of them had unconventional and difficult lives as well. One of them is quite famous, is what we know as Mary Shelley. So she she started in life as Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin, but she ended up being Mary Shelley, so she wrote Frankenstein and all that. And Mary Wollstonecraft died at 38, as I said, soon after the birth of Mary Shelley for childbirth-related complications, which I think is relevant because it's relevant with some of the stuff that I'm going to say. This is another picture of her. Her first publication was on the education of daughters, and then she went on to write about politics, history, and philosophy in critical reviews, translations, pamphlets, and novels as well. Here's a kind of brief overview of her major works. First one, Thoughts on the Education of Daughters in 1787, Mary of Fiction in 1788, A Vindication of the Rights of Men in 1790, A Vindication of the Rights of Women in 1792. This is the work I'm going to focus mostly on. And a very nice book called Letters Written During a Short Residence in Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, 1796. She actually traveled to these places and she wrote what she saw there. It's quite interesting. Okay, so we're going to focus on 18th century women because that's what she knew. We're going to focus especially on middle class women because that is the group she's, by her own admission, mostly interested in. The common view of the time, of course, was that women are irrational, unreliable, childish, vain, and sly. And even more than that, everything is negative, of course. What is interesting about Wollstonecraft is that instead of saying, oh no, this is not true, she is actually starting off by saying, yes, it is true that women are like that. There's a reason why they are irrational, unreliable, and so on and so forth. And the reason is ignorance and need. So the idea is that it is because women are excluded from most of the rights men enjoy that they use cunning, she says, to obtain indirectly a little of that power of which they are unjustly denied a share. But Wollstonecraft argues we can only discriminate against women if it can be proved that they indeed inherently lack reason, and this has remained unproven so far. And in fact, it cannot be proven because she says the nature of reason must be the same in all, if it be an emanation of divinity, the tie that connects the creature with the creator. So basically the idea is that God has made all equal and we all have reason, men as well as women. So she thinks that it is not correct to base women's exclusion on what we perceive to be as their intellectual inferiority, but on the contrary, it's precisely because they are excluded that they become inferior, both morally and intellectually. So Wollstonecraft thinks that knowledge and independence are the foundation of both private and public virtue, and without them, it is impossible to fulfill one's own duties within the family and as a citizen. She also thinks that, of course, education plays a very important central role, actually, as the means through which knowledge and independence can obtain. So the upshot is that if we want women, and men as well, to be virtuous, then we must educate them. So I said that part of my talk would be about a sort of triad: knowledge, independence, and virtue. And here I'm going to explore these notions a bit more. So that the moral and intellectual development of half of the human population is hindered represents an obstacle to the advancement of the whole species. And this is the reason why Wollstonecraft, she says, wants to see women placed in a station in which she would advance instead of retarding the progress of those glorious principles that give a substance to morality. So she thinks that knowledge must be common to all, or it will be inefficacious with respect to its influence on general practice. So she thinks that women should be equipped by education to become the companion of men, this is what she says. Otherwise, she will stop the progress of knowledge and virtue. So education, a proper education, is the basis of every kind of knowledge, intended as a capacity to see things not only superficially, but and by appealing to someone else's authority, but to understand them through speculation and judgment. What about virtue? So this is from Lina Dinias. She is a famous Wollstonecraft scholar. She has pointed out that for Wollstonecraft, virtue is both a habit of an independent mind that deliberates in accordance with reason, and also something like universal benevolence. And Wollstonecraft thinks that a way of life is not virtuous if it is not practiced in a reasoned way by an informed agent who decides in accordance with her own conscience and considerations to act in a certain way rather than in another. So there is no virtue, as I brought here on the slide, without rational knowledge. So we see that knowledge and virtue are connected. What about independence? So there is no virtue without independence, according to Wollstonecraft. She thinks that independence is the grand blessing of life, the basis of every virtue. And for her, independence is not self-sufficiency, but rather freedom from the arbitrary power of others and intellectual autonomy. So there is a link here, if you want, between Wollstonecraft's understanding of independence and what we would now call the Republican conception of freedom, as in freedom from the arbitrary power of others, but also a connection with what we now would now say is the kind of more liberal understanding of freedom, because she talks about intellectual autonomy. Anyway, I'm not going to go into much detail about this, but of course you can ask me later. She thinks, of course, that the opposite of independence is tyranny. So denying independence to someone in the family or the state is tyranny, which is contrary to reason and extremely unjust because it is unable to promote the well-being of everyone, even if it tries to do so, technically it tries to do so. And also, tyranny is contrary to virtue because it fosters social inequality instead of universal benevolence or virtue. And she thinks that, of course, men act as tyrants when she says when they force all women by denying them civil and political rights to remain immured in their families, groping in the dark. A powerful way to say what the situation of many women was at the time. She also thinks, interestingly, that excluding women from civil and political participation is not even an effective way to bind them to their duty or to their duties, because duty as virtue needs to be grounded in reason and not in ignorance and coercion. And this is why she says that the more understanding women acquire, the more they will be attached to their duty, comprehending it. For unless they comprehend it, unless their morals be fixed on the same immutable principle as those of man, no authority can make them discharge it in a virtuous manner. So those who are excluded from rights and who live a life of inequality and coercion will always try to subvert a system of which they do not partake and also they do not understand. So until women are treated as equals, they will never be able to fulfill their duties, and they shouldn't be expected to fulfill their duties either because they're not granted corresponding rights. So in Wollstonecraft's thought, philosophy more generally, virtue based on reason is the end to which humanity aspires, while independence and knowledge are the means to obtain it. These qualities, in turn, they depend mostly on education, which, according to Wollstonecraft, is not only preparation for life, but is also the first step to form of being advancing gradually towards perfection. So education is the foundation stone of knowledge and independence, and therefore it is also the foundation of every virtue. And it is the first thing that needs to be improved if we want to improve society as a whole. So Wollstonecraft, so far we've seen that she regards female contemporaries as bound in a perpetual state of childhood because they lack knowledge, and also of slavery because they lack independence. And she thinks that education is a proper antidote to this situation. And so an analysis of the condition of women cannot be separated from a critique of the education system as a relevant source of female vices and what she calls a state of submission to male power. So Wollstonecraft thinks that the neglected status of education, she says, is the ground source of misery in our society. She thinks that women are rendered weak and wretched by a variety of concurring causes, and one of them is a false system of education. That's why the title is A False System of Education, gathered from the books written on this subject by men who, considering females rather as women than human creatures, have been more anxious to make them alluring mistresses than affectionate wives and mothers. Why false education? Why does she think that this is false? Well, basically, it is the fact that it prevents women from acquiring the necessary knowledge and independence to become virtuous members of the human society. The pursuing of a sound knowledge is denied to women because they are prevented from acquiring a rational and independent character from which everything else flows. So they are destined to spend their youth learning a series of futile skills and false notions of beauty. And so their education is fostered only insofar as it is directed towards the goal of a good marriage, which is, as Wollstonecraft points out, the only way women can rise in the world. And this is the object which consumes most of their time. So finding a good match, finding a good husband, not good as in good to them, good as in someone with the necessary status and wealth. And she thinks that this is something that to which their persons are often legally prostituted. And this longing for an advantageous marriage, which is inculcated from an early age, makes, she said, mere animals of them. And after being married, these women act as such children might be expected to act, because their body and mental growth is stunted, and they are condemned to remain in a state of minority their entire life. Also, because women are educated for a supposedly feminine role, so to be some sort of kind of sexual and domestic servants, their education lacks order and method, and they learn by snatches and more by sheer observation on real life than from speculation and judgment, she thinks, what Wollstonecraft thinks. So they are taught some disciplines, but superficially and only in relation to some bodily accomplishment. And so she says that they acquire manners before morals, and the knowledge of life before they have any acquaintance with the grand ideal outline of human nature. This is what she says. And so they become a prey to prejudices, and taking all their opinions on credit, they blindly submit to authority. And blind submission to authority, which in turn leads to equally blind obedience, is exactly the purpose for which women's intellect is left uncultivated. So education and power are closely connected. She says that as blind obedience is ever sought for power, parents and sensualists are in the right when they endeavor to keep women in the dark, because the former only wants a slave and the latter a plaything. So women's education is confined, at least of course in Wollstonecraft's time, confined to the art of pleasing men, pursuing idle pleasures. But while these accomplishments are obtained, much more is lost, according to her, because women, by being confined to the reign of the senses and being denied access to rational knowledge, become physically and psychologically dependent on men. They have no independence, and therefore they are unable to lead a life of virtue. In fact, women are not only prevented from acquiring a sound knowledge of the world, they are also prevented from becoming morally and intellectually independent individuals. And marriage cannot be expected to bring any chance of improvement in their behavior, she says, because for the woman who has only been taught to please will soon find that a charms are a bleak sunbeam, and that they cannot have much effect on her husband's heart when they are seen every day when the summer is past and gone. So a woman who has only been trained in pleasing and flirting and whose intellectual faculties have been stunted from the very beginning will probably become jealous and vain, or scandal, will even try to conquer other men. She will not be able to find alternative sources of occupation or happiness because all she knows is how to please men. And neglect on the part of her husband will only make this woman's mind and body broken by discontent. So, of course, Wollstonecraft argues that a wife should never be forced to base her happiness on her husband's affection, neglecting for that all her other duties as a daughter and a mother, as well as the respect that she must have for herself. She thinks that a woman should become the friend and not the humble dependent of her husband. Wollstonecraft is very insistent on this point because she thinks that it's very important that we tackle this issue. So the idea that women are imbibed with false notions of love from an early age, they are taught to stick to these notions with absolute zeal, that knowing how to please a man so as to be loved by him in return is their only aim in life, and one that excludes all knowledge and virtues. She says that women have resigned their liberty to a superior strength to enjoy with impunity the pleasure of the moment. In the same way, this is the point she's trying to bring home, as men submit to kings and other powerful individuals. So we can trace actually a parallel between women's condition as a group and that of society as a whole. So Wollstonecraft points out that the world is governed by brutal force. If it were governed by sound politics, then liberty and freedom would be widespread, and mankind, including women, would become more wise and virtuous. So it is not surprising that women submit to being degraded into a condition of slavery, Wollstonecraft thinks, because men themselves and the general public submit everywhere to oppression when they only to lift up their heads to throw off the yoke. So we can see the kind of political philosopher here as well as the advocate of rights. So the fact that women are subjugated within the family is degrading for both sexes, but especially for women. They live their entire life in a cage, imbibed by false notions of love and beauty. They come to internalize that situation and to consider it a natural one. Physical and psychological domination, she says, foster moral corruption and hinder a person's capacity to assume a critical stance against her oppressed status and her oppressor. And the same applies to society as a whole. That is to say, the subjugated state of women within the family reflects the subjugated state of everyone within a society. And those men who act as tyrants towards their wives and daughters are in turn oppressed by the powerful in the social compact. They could liberate themselves from domination if they wanted to, but they lack the intellectual and moral resources to do so. So to free both men and women from their enslavement, a broader change is needed according to Wollstonecraft, and we can only get it through a better general education. So what should this education consist in? So Wollstonecraft, of course, as I mentioned, claims that the current for her, of course, system of education, if there is any at all, is inadequate for a good upbringing of both boys and girls. Female education is certainly the most neglected, but the improvements which may be brought to it are equally valid for both sexes. So the important thing here, which was quite revolutionary for the time, is that she thinks that girls and boys should be equally educated. They should be educated in the same way, as in they should do the same things, they should study the same subjects, they should be in the same classroom. So her project is a general one, which is applicable at a national level. And again, we're talking about a time in which there was no public funded education. So if you were, of course, wealthy, you would have your tutors, but that was it. So the prime purpose of education is to prepare people to be virtuous family members and good citizens. Knowledge and independent thinking should be promoted along with equality, she thinks, because virtue cannot be expected to flourish in a situation of physical and mental subordination. And because the goal to which education aims is that of creating virtuous members of society, it should be public. She says, for the good effects resulting from attention to private education will ever be very confined, and the parent who really puts his own hand to the plough will always in some degree be disappointed till education becomes a grand national concern. To teach children how to relate with each other in a society of equals, they should be educated amongst other children without distinction of gender or class, at least for the first years. And again, this was quite a revolutionary proposal for the time. So not only boys and girls together, but also children from different social classes together. And they should all be encouraged to learn. She thinks that it is not for the benefit of society that a few brilliant men should be brought forward at the expense of the multitude. But at the same time, Wollstonecraft thinks that it is very important that because children are going to be, well, they are already family members and they're going to be family members for their entire life, they should be able to maintain their family affection. So she rejects the idea of boarding schools and proposes something more like a country day school, something like the school that she actually had for a few years. So children would live at home and go to lessons during the day. And in this way, you would end up obtaining two positive results. So the domestic affections, she says, that first open the heart to the various modifications of humanity would be cultivated, whilst the children were nevertheless allowed to spend a grand part of their time in terms of equality with other children. Also, sounds quite obvious to us, but she thinks that, I mean, if she has to say, maybe it wasn't so obvious then, that children should be taught in accordance with their age, instead of forced to learn only by rote without understanding. And so they will become more conscious and independent in their thoughts. And also they should be allowed to take the air and play outdoors. And this applies again to both sexes, because Wollstonecraft believes that girls in our time are rendered weak both physically and mentally by the lack of physical exercise, and also by being denied the opportunity to spend some time free from constrictions and strict supervision. Of course, at some point, education will be different from some people. The boys and girls of fortune or superior abilities, which is quite interesting again, should be able to carry on this kind of conjoined education for the whole of their young life, studying, again, the same subjects, including politics. And this would allow young people, men and women, or young men and young women, to form long life bonds of friendship and respect, and even to find suitable companions with whom to contract a marriage. The two birds with one stone. So the kind of school that she's proposing is, as you will have noticed, primarily a school of morality that promotes equality and friendship between citizens in general and between the sexes in particular. A common education and the study of traditionally male disciplines such as politics would also, according to her, enable young women to participate in all the political and civil enjoyments, she says, which men enjoy, instead of being confined to their needle, and thus render them fit to fulfill the peculiar duties which nature has assigned them. So Wollstonecraft points out that to render mankind more virtuous and, of course, happier, both sexes must act from the same principle. but they cannot be expected to do that when only one is allowed to see the reasonableness of it. So again, until women are kept in a state of inferiority and ignorance, they will never understand the principle of morality, they will never be able to act virtuously, they will never be able to become peers to men. And this situation is bad not only for women, but for the whole social compact. So the project of a public national education is actually the project of a more conscious and democratic society in which every individual enjoys equal status and is able to understand and therefore fulfill their duties as family members and as citizens. Okay, we get now to the final part of my presentation, which concerns, as I mentioned earlier, marriage, parenthood, and citizenship. So, as we have seen, Wollstonecraft's educational project is structured in a way that emphasizes the relation between the family and the state, that is, between being a good parent and a partner, and being a virtuous citizen. But what kind of citizens should women become? So, what kind of, how would such an education equip women as well as men to be virtuous citizens? And what kind of citizens we want them to be? And here we see the first objection, I guess, to what Wollstonecraft has said so far. So the idea that education will make women free, to relate it back to my original question. We got Laura Brace here. She says that by stressing the nurturing role of women as if it were a natural duty, Wollstonecraft's route to equality brings us to an empire of difference. So the problem here is that after much arguing for women's independence, Wollstonecraft seems to propose a kind of education which has the only aim to make them better wives and mothers. So the project of women's intellectual and moral independence seems to be undermined by the very fact that so much stress is put upon the tie between being a better educated woman and a better companion and parent, or mother in this case. A possible response to this objection is that, yeah, of course, it is undeniable that in Wollstonecraft's view, women do indeed have the moral duty to be good daughters, wives, and mothers. And she also clearly states that women may have different duties to fulfill than men. But I also think that Brace's reading of Wollstonecraft seems to kind of underestimate the extent to which Wollstonecraft also insists that the duties performed by women are above all human duties, equally dictated by reason to both sexes. So she says that women connected with men as daughters, wives, and mothers, their moral character might be estimated by the manner of fulfilling those simple duties. But the grand end of their exertion should be to unfold their own faculties and acquire the dignity of conscious virtue. So to acquire knowledge is for women a duty primarily for themselves and only then for their family and their state. Another objection here, which is kind of going in the opposite direction, if you want. The first one was about creating an empire of difference. This one is about not recognizing the actual difference between men and women, especially in that society. So Mary Gatens this time, she has pointed out that while Wollstonecraft attempts to extend men's right to women, she fails to take into account the fact that male and female embodiment, at least as lived in the 18th century culture, involved vastly different social and political consequences. So Wollstonecraft, according to Gatens, accepts the natural foundation of the sexual division of labor. And because of that, she does not address the fact that marriage, parenthood, and the establishment of the private familial unit do not intrude on men's access to the public sphere, while the same cannot be said of women. So The idea here is that while fatherhood does not seem to represent an essential requirement for the enjoyment of civil rights, in the case of women, their role as mothers seems to have the upper hand over that of citizens. Again, a possible reply. Wollstonecraft thinks that the private and the public spheres are not separable or separate. So in her view, good citizens are actually good family members and vice versa. She says that a man has been termed a microcosm, and every family might also be called a state. So same way as corruption in the family reflects corruption in the broader social compact. As I mentioned before, independence and rationality are needed in both private and public life, political life. So for Wollstonecraft, not only women will have naturally the role of mothers to perform, because they are the ones naturally fit to bear and nurture children, but in the same way, men will have their particular roles as fathers and respectful husbands to fulfill. And in fact, Wollstonecraft often, throughout her works, remarks that men themselves should become more virtuous and fulfill their duties first. She says, "For till men become attentive to the duty of a father, it is vain to expect women to spend that time in the nursery which they choose to spend at their class." So another way in which we can kind of defend Wollstonecraft's account is by going back to her notion of independence. Independence for Wollstonecraft is not just rationally choosing one's own way of life. It's also the capacity to understand one's own duty and social position and fulfill them in the best way possible according to reason. So the alternatives are between fulfilling a duty, the duty that you have, poorly and ignorantly, or reasonably and virtuously. So independence is intended as intellectual and moral autonomy, rather than just simply liberty of action. Also, independence is something like the embracing of a given duty rather than the critical attitude towards it. So according to this position, educated and independent women would be able to better fulfill their duties as mothers and wives instead of really questioning them. So the duties are there. If we are educated, we understand them and we can perform them, fulfill them better. And it has been argued, especially by Alan Coffey, that independence is in fact not incompatible with family life, because independent partners would treat each other as equals and would rely on each other's dutiful contribution for the well-functioning and well-being of their family. Nonetheless, it might be argued that Wollstonecraft does not take into account the eventuality that independent women, especially if provided with a broad set of interests and aspirations by a good education, such as the one that she has proposed, might not be willing to become wives and mothers. So, Wollstonecraft seems to reduce women's functions to that of being mothers and housewives in an attempt to recognize and incorporate their sexual differences into a form of citizenship. But in a system in which citizenship is so tightly related to marriage and parenthood, then a woman without a family would be in some way excluded from the social compact. And it's true that Wollstonecraft seems to justify women's moral obligation to be wise mothers and wives by appealing to men's corresponding role as fathers and husbands. But again, in doing so, marriage and parenthood are established as the basis for society, and the possession of full citizenship seems to be restricted, at least in a moral sense, to a narrow group of people than that of the whole society, including people who do not have children. Again, a possible answer to that is that Wollstonecraft is not concerned with the situation of single or childless women, because she assumes that most people desire to be married and to have children. And so those who do not share this desire would be a minority, according to her, not affecting the system as such. And there is some evidence to this interpretation. For instance, she argues that the best works and of greatest merit for the public have proceeded from the unmarried or childless men and women. But she also says that the welfare of society is not built on extraordinary exertions. And were more reasonably organized, there would be still less need for great abilities or heroic virtues. So arguably, Wollstonecraft is not excluding other possibilities, but simply stating that the majority would behave in a certain way. Besides, Wollstonecraft touches the issue of women who are single by choice, when she also says that women should be allowed to be employed in the same jobs and occupations as men do. So she's convinced that in order to render that private virtue public benefit, they must have a civil existence in the state, married or single. So women should have rights that safeguard their equality and independence, and should even be allowed to represent themselves in the deliberations of government. So she's thinking about women politicians. So single and married women should all be able to enjoy all aspects of civil life without depending on men for social and legal recognition. There are other two exclusions in Wollstonecraft thought beside the one about single women I'm briefly going to touch on because I'm aware that I've spoken for a while. One exclusion, I mean, you may have noticed that Wollstonecraft doesn't really talk about upper class women. She's very clear that she intends to talk about into middle class women. And the reasoning behind it is that she thinks that they appear to be in the most natural state, while upper class women are basically lost. They are irretrievably corrupted by their condition of extreme weakness, artificiality, idleness, and vainness. Also, because Wollstonecraft does not directly address lower class women, it has also been argued that she's blind to that plea as well. That she fails to recognize the tensions between motherhood and citizenship, and how they affect middle class and working class women in different ways. But, and this is my final defense of Wollstonecraft, it would be unfair to suggest that Wollstonecraft is not interested at all in women who work to earn their living. And in fact, she had to do so herself for most of her life. So as early as in the Thoughts on the Education of Daughters, which is the first work that she published, she deplored the scarcity of respectable jobs for educated women left without a fortune. And she said that few are the modes of earning a subsistence, and those very humiliating, such as being a humble companion to some rich lady, a teacher in a school, or a governess, all jobs that she performed. And these remarks, which are repeated in the Vindication, are relevant to the situation of middle-class women, but they can also be extended more widely because she thinks that women's occupations are presently only domestic ones, and even women of a superior caste have not a road open by which they can pursue more extensive plans of usefulness and independence. And I mean, this is important again because of her idea of independence. So she thinks that one's own subsistence by work is the true definition of independence, and that women should be allowed to be physicians, politicians, farmers, shopkeepers, and even soldiers. And then if we can achieve that, then they would not marry for support or endure servitude and prostitution. She also thinks that a woman who earns her own bread by fulfilling any duty is always much more respectable than the most accomplished beauty. So many poor women who maintain their children by the sweat of their brow and keep together families that the vices of their fathers would have scattered abroad are actually more virtuous than those rich women softened rather than refined by civilization. The problem here is, of course, at least in the 18th century, both middle class and working class women lived in a perpetual state of physical and legal dependence from men. And there are some very dramatic portraits that Wollstonecraft traces of a contemporary female fellows in a book called Maria, which is a fiction which she didn't complete because she died. And in this book, I mean, we see a lot of women that live in moral material misery, often in both. The main characters are Maria and Jemima, and the other women's sketched are different from backgrounds and experiences, but their pitiful situations are all a consequence of being women born in a world shaped and dominated by men, to the point that Maria asked herself, was not the world a vast prison and women born slaves? So for Wollstonecraft, a woman, whatever her class, is differently positioned from a man. In a man's world, all women are prostituted. These are words by Barbara Taylor. So lack of economic, legal, and social independence are the ties that keep every woman enslaved and relegated to the status of a man's possession. And because women are prevented from acquiring knowledge in all the fields that are open to men and from developing the skills that would enable them to be more than like vain children, they are also barred from pursuing a life of civic and personal virtue. Would education solve this? Well, even if we reform education, that will not in itself be sufficient to change the situation, especially since oppression is not a feature of a specific group, that is women, but pervades the society at large. So in the same way as women are corrupted by the subordinate condition, men subordinate women because they are rendered vicious by an unfair society. However, Wollstonecraft believes that society can progress towards the realization of a state of virtue and morality. And so she thinks that that there would be no Maria or Jemima if women were able to pursue a respectable life and be endowed with rights, and that there would be no wicked men if they were taught to respect women from their infancy, and if they saw women employed in the same activities and enjoying the same grade of independence. So to finish off, this is my last slide, I promise. A more equitable educational system, according to Wollstonecraft, may form more equal and independent citizens and may be the first step towards a more equitable, happy, and intellectually advanced society. In Wollstonecraft's words, when I wish to see my sex become more like moral agents, my heart bounds with the anticipation of the general diffusion of that sublime contentment which only morality can diffuse. And this is it. Thank you.